The
Keep your
Mercedes
gorilla
S-Class
hands
glided through
off my
Manhattan's
car.
rain-slick streets,
Jakar.
windshield wipers keeping steady rhythm against the October drizzle. Inside the luxury sedan, where the air should have been hushed and refined, tension crackled like static electricity. Margaret Reynolds, CEO of Metascan Technologies, gripped her phone so tightly her manicured nails threatened to crack the screen. Her golden hair, usually styled to perfection, had begun to loosen from its tight bun. Mascara smudged beneath one eye. Richard, what do you mean all three agencies are fully booked? The Nakasing delegation lands in 90 minutes. This is a $1.2 billion deal. In the driver's seat, James Wilson kept his eyes focused on the road. 52 years old, with salt and pepper hair and a face that had weathered more storms than this Manhattan downpour, he navigated the car with practiced precision. His posture remained military straight in his black uniform, his expression neutral despite the chaos unfolding behind him. James heard everything, the desperation in Margaret's voice, the panic underlying her professional veneer. Her company was on the brink. He'd pieced that together over 3 years of driving her to meetings, overhearing phone calls, watching the gradual tightening of her expressions as weeks became months. Soft jazz hummed from the car's premium speakers. James reached forward to turn it off, hoping to give Margaret one less distraction. Before his fingers touched the dial, her voice sliced through the air. "Keep your gorilla hands off my car." The words hung between them like ice crystals. James's hand froze midair, then slowly returned to the steering wheel. In the rearview mirrors, his blue eyes, typically gentle, reflected something deeper than hurt, something that looked like bone-deep exhaustion. 3 years. 3 years of comments like that. Images flashed through James's mind, crystal clear memories that seemed to belong to another lifetime. Tokyo G7 Summit 2015. He'd stood behind 3 presidents, his voice preventing a trade war from erupting. The Georgetown honorary doctorate, Harvard master's degree in applied linguistics, 20 years serving at the highest levels of the State Department, fluent in 5 languages. And now the help. Margaret exhaled sharply, her voice arctic. "Raise the divider. I'm done looking at you." The glass partition slid up with a faint hiss. James sat motionless, jaw clenched. No tears fell. Men like James Wilson didn't cry over insults from people like Margaret Reynolds. Because James knew something Margaret didn't. The man she had just called a gorilla was about to become her only hope of salvation. The Mercedes continued its smooth journey through the concrete canyons of Manhattan, carrying 2 people separated by a glass divider in a vast gulf of understanding. From his driver's camera, James watched Margaret unravel in the back seat. She made her 7th call, voice cracking with desperation. "Susan, I don't care if it costs $50,000. Find me someone who speaks Japanese, French, and Hindi right now. We can't postpone. They'll withdraw for good." 3 years of negotiation gone. 3 years ago, James had sat in this very car when the Berlin deal collapsed because of a communication error. 6 months ago, the sole negotiation disintegrated after Margaret used improper honorifics while addressing Samsung's CEO. 40 million gone overnight. James knew exactly how to prevent today's disaster, but he'd chosen silence. Why would Margaret listen? She never had before. But today was different. Today, 200 people would lose their buy-ins, including him. His daughter Sarah, a sophomore at Johns Hopkins, still believed her father worked as a linguistics consultant, writing a book on diplomatic language. Each month, James wired her tuition, $68,000 a year, with the message, "Here's Dad's research funding for this month, sweetheart." Sarah always replied, "You're the best dad in the world." Every time he read those words, James clenched his teeth and kept driving. Through the rear camera, he observed Margaret pacing in the confined space of the back seat. Her hair had come completely loose, mascara streaked beneath red-rimmed eyes. This wasn't the woman featured on Forbes' cover last year. This was someone drowning. Margaret's phone kept ringing, only to connect to voicemails. She trembled, dialing again, desperation evident in every movement. Through the speaker, James heard her next call to Richard Morrison, Metascan's legal advisor. "Richard, if they pull out..." Her voice broke. For the first time in 3 years, James heard genuine emotion crack through Margaret Reynolds' careful facade. That was the moment James made his decision. He lowered the partition. "Excuse me, Miss Reynolds." Margaret flinched, eyes blazing with fury at the interruption. I told you, what language do you need? The air inside the car seemed to freeze. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. She forgot about Richard waiting on the other end of the line. What did you just say? James met her gaze through the mirror. His tone steady, professional, completely at odds with his position as her driver. For the merger, which languages do you need? That's none of your business. Japanese, French, and Hindi. Something in his voice made Margaret falter. This wasn't the quiet chauffeur she'd known for 3 years. I'm fluent in Japanese, French, German, Spanish, and English. I can handle the translation and cultural protocols for your meeting. Margaret's world tilted on its axis. Her phone slipped from her grasp, hitting the leather seat with a soft thud. You speak 5 languages. Would you like me to prove it? Before she could respond, her phone rang again. The name flashing on the screen made her stomach drop. Iwasaki Kenji, Tokyo HQ. Margaret looked at the phone, then at James, then back at the phone. Pride and desperation waged war across her features. The ringtone echoed through the car's luxurious interior. Finally, she handed the phone through the small opening in the divider, her hand visibly trembling. She said nothing, but both knew this was the moment everything changed. James lifted the phone to his ear. Gone was the modest, hesitant tone of a chauffeur. What emerged instead was calm, confident, authoritative, the voice of a man who had once lived in the world of high-stakes diplomacy. Moshi Moshi Iwasaki-san, James Wilson to Moshi Masu. The line went still. There was a brief silence, then a man's voice replied in flawless, fluid Japanese. Margaret sat frozen. She couldn't understand what they were saying, but she could feel the shift in the atmosphere. James wasn't merely interpreting, he was negotiating. He tilted his head slightly, listening carefully, nodding occasionally, responding with phrases that seemed to soften the voice on the other end, making it warmer, more receptive. The precise rhythm of his pauses, the way he said, Iwasaki-san. Every gesture carried deep cultural understanding. Then another voice joined in, speaking rapid French. Without missing a beat, James switched languages, flowing seamlessly between Japanese and French. His pronunciation was flawless, his vocabulary extensive and technical. Margaret recognized phrases about intellectual property transfer market, entry strategy, liability, frameworks. The most sensitive points in the merger, the very issues threatening to collapse 3 years of work. 20 minutes passed. The Mercedes continued its journey through rain-soaked Manhattan, but inside time seemed suspended. Finally, James bowed his head slightly and ended the call with respectful grace. Arigato gozaimasu, Iwasaki-san. He handed the phone back to a stunned Margaret. They're looking forward to meeting you in person. The merger discussions are back on track. Margaret stared at her phone as if it might explode. What? What did you just do? James looked straight ahead, his tone calm and professional, as if saving billion-dollar deals was something he did routinely. Just a small cultural misunderstanding. Your legal team used overly aggressive language in the preliminary contract. They felt they were being treated as subordinates, not partners. The color drained from Margaret's face. What kind of misunderstanding? The kind that can kill a deal. The car crossed an intersection, red traffic light, reflecting across James's stern profile. I explained that Metascan deeply respects their family business legacy and that you personally study Japanese corporate customs to show your regard. Margaret's mouth fell open in disbelief. But I never, now you have, James replied, evenly, eyes fixed on the road ahead while Margaret sat in shocked silence. The rain fell harder as the Mercedes turned into the underground parking lot beneath the Metascan headquarters on Avenue of the Americas. The engine quieted, leaving only the echo of water dripping onto concrete in the cavernous space. For the first time in 3 years, Margaret spoke his name. James, I need to know everything. James met her eyes in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, the divider between them seemed like more than just glass. PhD in International Relations from Georgetown, Master's in Applied Linguistics from Harvard, 20 years as a senior diplomatic interpreter for the State Department. Each word struck Margaret like a physical blow. I specialized in multinational negotiations, G7 summits, trade agreements, crisis mediation. He paused, voice steady and low. Budget cuts eliminated my position 3 years ago. I needed work immediately. Your mother's medical bills, Margaret murmured, remembering fragments of phone calls she'd overheard. Cancer, wasn't it? James nodded. cancer treatment, and my daughter's medical school tuition. Sarah studies at Johns Hopkins. She wants to be a pediatric oncologist because she watched her grandmother fight the disease. The fluorescent parking garage light cast harsh shadows across both their faces. I sent out more than 300 job applications, James continued. Overqualified for some, too old for others. So you became a driver. I became whatever I had to be to survive. Their eyes met in the mirror. In that instant, 3 years of quiet service behind the wheel suddenly took on massive weight, a presence Margaret had never truly seen or acknowledged. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca, her assistant. The Naka Singh delegation arrived early. They're in the lobby asking about cultural protocols. No one knows what to say. They're here, Margaret whispered. James stepped out, walked around the car, and opened her door. Same motion, same professional grace as always. But this time, everything was different. Margaret rose to her feet, really looking at him for the first time. Will you help me save my company? James lifted his gaze, eyes steady and clear. Let's save it together, Miss Reynolds. The elevator ascended silently to the 15th floor. Margaret stood beside James, the physical distance between them, barely a meter, yet it felt like an entire universe. She studied his reflection in the mirrored walls. The black chauffeur's uniform, the neatly knotted tie, a 52-year-old face lined with creases, born not from time, but from everything he had witnessed, carried, and endured in silence. 3 years of seeing this man every day, yet never truly seeing him. James, she began, voice hoarse. Miss Reynolds, James interrupted gently but firmly. We have about an hour to prepare for the most important meeting in your company's history. Personal apologies can wait. He was right, but Margaret couldn't shake the echo of her own words. Keep your gorilla hands off my car. They hung between them like smoke after a fire. The elevator doors slid open. Rebecca Nolan, her 28-year-old assistant with neatly tied auburn hair, rushed forward, face pale with stress. Margaret, thank God. The advanced delegation is in meeting room A. They're asking about cultural protocols and nobody knows what handled. Margaret cut her off decisively. Rebecca, this is James Wilson, our new translation advisor. Rebecca froze, her eyes dropping to James's chauffeur uniform, then flicking back to Margaret in bewilderment. I'm sorry, what did you say, Mr. Wilson will be overseeing all international communications for the merger. But he's a Georgetown PhD, fluent in 5 languages. Margaret's voice was sharp as glass. Any further questions? Color flooded Rebecca's cheeks as she lowered her gaze. No, ma'am. Good. Margaret turned to James. One small thing. James waited patiently. You should probably change before meeting the delegation. James smiled, a faint, calm expression tinged with quiet sadness. You're right. Rebecca escorted James down to the lobby to the luxury menswear store Metascan kept for emergency client meetings. Left alone, Margaret stood in her corner office on the 42nd floor, a glass room facing Central Park. Now just a gray mass drowning in rain. She looked down at her hands, still trembling. Again she heard her own voice echoing, Keep your gorilla hands off my car. Who had said that? What kind of woman had she become? Margaret walked to the liquor cabinet, poured herself a glass of 25-year Macallan, took a sip, then set it down by the window. In the reflection, she saw herself, 41 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, wearing a $5,000 Armani suit and carrying a soul she no longer recognized. Her phone buzzed. A name she hadn't dialed in months. Mom. Margaret answered. Mom, Maddie's sweetheart. The warm voice of Eleanor Reynolds, 68, retired in Vermont, filled the line. I saw the news about your big deal closing soon. Yes, Mom, are you all right? You sound tired. Margaret gazed out the window as raindrops streaked down the glass. Suddenly, tears welled up in her eyes. Mom, I think I've forgotten what you used to teach me. Silence fell on the other end, then her mother's voice soft as a summer breeze, Maddie. I taught you that strength isn't about who you look down on, but who you still see when they're beneath you. A sob caught in Margaret's throat. I did something awful today, Mom. Then fix it, sweetheart, Eleanor said gently. It's never too late to become who you want to be. Margaret closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks, merging with the sound of rain outside. 15 minutes later, the office door opened. Margaret had to stop herself from gasping. James walked in, dressed in a navy Hugo Boss suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. A silver silk tie complemented polished black Oxford shoes. His hair was neatly combed, the silver strands at his temples, adding distinction rather than age. But the greatest transformation wasn't in the clothes. It was in his bearing. Shoulders squared, chin lifted slightly. The blue eyes that once stayed lowered now met hers directly. Steady, confident, composed. This was no longer her driver. This was a diplomat, a man who had once participated in negotiations where wars could begin or end with a single misplaced word. Better, James asked. Much better, Margaret murmured, her voice softer than before. Rebecca appeared at the door. Meeting room A is ready. The advanced delegation is waiting. Margaret drew a deep breath and straightened her suit. Before stepping out, she turned back to James. Are you ready? James Wilson, the former senior interpreter of the U.S. State Department, underestimated for 3 long years, smiled with quiet confidence. Miss Reynolds, I've mediated disputes between nations. I think I can handle a business meeting. For the first time in months, Margaret felt something she had nearly forgotten. Hope. The two walked out side by side, no longer employer and employee, but two people about to fight for the same cause. Conference Room A of Metascan Technologies radiated American corporate power. A 10-meter walnut table, Italian leather chairs, glass walls overlooking 6th Avenue. Today, the air inside felt stretched tight like a violin string about to snap. The advanced delegation from Nakasing conglomerate consisted of 3 Japanese senior directors and 1 Indian advisor. They all stood when Margaret and James entered. James stepped forward. He bowed, depth, angle, and duration measured to the exact cultural specifications. Not too low to seem servile, not too high to appear disrespectful. Then he spoke in Japanese, his voice carrying no trace of an American accent. The lead director, Tanaka-san, blinked in surprise, then smiled and replied warmly. James turned to Margaret and said quietly, Mr. Tanaka says they're pleased that Metascan sent someone who truly understands Japanese business culture. He feels respected. Margaret nodded, heart racing. Tell him Metascan doesn't see this as merely a deal, but as a long-term relationship between 2 family-run legacies. James gave a subtle nod and translated. But he didn't just relay her words. He interpreted her tone, adding cultural nuance, weaving phrases with a Japanese rhythm that conveyed sincerity and respect. The atmosphere began to shift. The tension slowly melted away. The meeting progressed with remarkable smoothness until minute 35 when Tanaka's expression suddenly changed. He spoke at length, his tone deepening. Pointing at a clause in the contract, James listened, eyes narrowing slightly. Something wrong, Margaret whispered. James turned to her, voice serious. Mr. Tanaka says Clause 7 in the draft contract is written too directly. In Japanese culture, that phrasing implies we see them as subordinates, not equal partners. The color drained from Margaret's face. That was precisely the kind of mistake that had torpedoed previous negotiations. Which clause? The one about final decision authority? James switched back to Japanese, his voice calm, warm, steady. He explained something with a tone that seemed to smooth troubled waters. Tanaka listened, his expression firm at first, then gradually softening. James continued, this time telling a story. Margaret caught fragments of English woven into the Japanese. Father, reconstruction, honor. A brief silence followed. Then Tanaka nodded firmly, smiling faintly, speaking at length with genuine warmth. What did he say? Margaret asked softly. James replied, his tone low and composed. He said his father once worked with Americans after the war. He understands that sometimes American legal language sounds rigid, but the true intent is cooperation. He's agreed to revise the clause toward a more balanced form. Margaret exhaled, relief washing over her, but a single question echoed in her mind. What did James say to make a Japanese executive change his stance in mere minutes? When the delegation finally left with warm handshakes and genuine smiles, Margaret closed the conference room door. Only she and James remained. What did you say to Mr. Tanaka about your father and rebuilding after the war? James removed his suit jacket and hung it carefully over a chair. For the first time, Margaret noticed signs of fatigue in his posture. I told him about my father. He was a civil engineer who worked in Japan from 1947 to 1952, helping rebuild Tokyo. Margaret sat down silent with realization. My father taught me that true cooperation doesn't live in contracts. It lives in trust in 2 sides building something greater than themselves. James turned toward the window where Manhattan was fading into dusk. I told him that his father, a survivor of Hiroshima and mine once worked together not as former enemies, but as men rebuilding the future. His voice slowed, carrying a quiet ache. I told him this merger isn't just about money, it's about continuing what our fathers began. Margaret felt her throat tighten. Was that true? Every word. The room fell silent. Outside, Manhattan's lights began to glow, glittering like an inverted night sky. James, Margaret whispered, these past 3 years, how many of my meetings have you listened to? All of them. And you knew the company was near bankruptcy. I knew since last August. Margaret ran a hand through her disheveled hair. Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you help me sooner? James met her gaze, his eyes kind but sorrowful. Miss Reynolds, I tried many times, but a driver isn't supposed to have opinions on corporate strategy, is he? Memories flooded back. A year ago, James had said Miss Reynolds about the soul meeting. Maybe we should, and she'd cut him off. James, you're just the driver. Don't try to be smart. 6 months ago, Miss Reynolds, I think the German team may have misunderstood. I didn't hire you to think, James. Each remembered line stabbed into her conscience. So many lost opportunities. So many disasters that could have been avoided. My fault, Margaret whispered, eyes glistening. All my fault. James slipped his jacket back on, his voice, calm but resolute. Miss Reynolds, we have 14 hours before the main meeting. The past doesn't matter anymore. Only the future. He placed a thick folder before her. Here's everything you need to know about tomorrow's attendees. Their histories, personalities, decision styles, and trigger points. Margaret opened it. Dozens of pages of handwritten notes, meticulous, organized, precise, like State Department dossiers. When did you make all this? She asked quietly. James smiled faintly. I've had quite a lot of free time these past 3 years, Miss Reynolds. 9 p.m. The offices of Metascan Technologies were empty except for the light from the boardroom where Margaret and James still sat amid mountains of documents. The table was buried in papers, organizational charts of the Nakamura Keiretsu, the Singh family dossiers, cultural analyses, in pages of negotiation strategies written in 3 languages. Margaret looked across the table. James was bent over his notes, brow furrowed in concentration. She held her 5th cup of coffee that night. James, she said softly, can I ask you something personal? He looked up expectantly. Why are you still helping me after everything I've said, after the way I've treated you for 3 years? James set down his pen. The silence stretched long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he opened his wallet and took out a photograph. This is Sarah, my daughter. Margaret looked at the picture, a young woman with a bright smile wearing a white medical student's coat. 22 second year at Johns Hopkins, majoring in pediatric oncology. His voice softened as he spoke of her. Sarah wants to heal children with cancer because she watched her grandmother fight the disease. He paused, swallowing hard. 3 months ago, Sarah called me crying. She said she might have to transfer to a community college because tuition was too high. Margaret felt as if someone had punched her in the stomach. I told her not to worry, that I'd take care of it. But the truth is, his voice cracked slightly. That same day, I had just come back from my 3rd job interview of the week, a coordinator position at a local community college. Salary $28,000 a year. He let out a quiet, bitter laugh. I almost took it. I was ready to tell her to transfer, to accept that my career had ended at 52. What changed? Margaret asked softly. Then this morning you needed me. James looked her straight in the eye, voice steady and calm. Miss Reynolds, saving your company isn't just about work or money. It's about proving that talent can exist anywhere and that a person's worth isn't defined by their title. He slipped Sarah's photo back into his wallet. It's about ensuring that my daughter and yours can grow up in a world where people are seen for who they truly are. Tears streamed down Margaret's face. For the first time in years, she didn't try to hide them. I have a daughter too, she whispered. Emma, 14. She's at Exeter. James blinked, surprised. I didn't know. No one does, Margaret said, wiping her tears. I keep my private life hidden. Last year, Emma asked me, Mom, why are you always so mean to everyone? She gave a small laugh that sounded more like a sob. My 14-year-old daughter thinks her mother is a monster. James stood, walked to the liquor cabinet, and poured 2 glasses of whiskey. He handed one to her. Tell me, he said quietly, what made you become this way? Margaret took a sip, feeling the burn slide down her throat, then exhaled deeply. I grew up in Brooklyn. My mom worked in an office. My father, She stopped, her eyes becoming distant. My father died when I was 16. Construction accident. The reflection of her silhouette glimmered in the window glass. My mother worked 3 jobs to put me through Columbia. Every night she'd say, "Maddie, you have to be strong. The world doesn't forgive weakness." James nodded, his voice low. "And you became strong." Margaret shook her head, giving a bitter smile. "No, I became ruthless. I climbed every rung of the ladder by stepping on others. I thought that was strength, but in truth her voice trembled. I was just repeating what had been done to me. When I was an intern, I was humiliated, called the poor girl from Brooklyn. And instead of breaking that cycle, I continued it." James remained silent. Only the ticking clock and the rain tapping against the glass filled the room. Margaret lowered her head, her voice shaking. "When I called you," she couldn't finish the words. In that moment, I heard the voices of those who once looked down on me, and I realized I'd become them. She turned to him, tears streaming freely now. "Emma was right. I am a monster. And worse, I've turned this company into a place that breeds more monsters like me." James set his glass down, his tone calm but resolute. "Miss Reynolds, realizing your fault is the first step, but it's what you do next that defines who you are." Margaret looked up, eyes red and swollen. "You still think I can change?" "I believe in second chances," James said, his voice warm. "For companies and for people." The phone buzzed. A text appeared from Emma. "Mom, we got the weekend off. Can I come home, miss you?" Margaret looked at the message, a trembling smile spreading across her lips. She turned to James. "James, when we save this company, not if, but when, I want you to help me rebuild it. Not just financially, but humanly." "How do you mean I want to create a place where no one is underestimated, where talent is seen no matter where it hides?" Her voice grew firmer. "A place my daughter can be proud of." James smiled, the first genuine smile she'd ever seen from him. "Then we better prepare well." They sat back down, 2 cups of cold coffee, hundreds of pages of notes, working until 3 in the morning. But this time they were no longer boss and employee. They were allies, 2 warriors preparing for the biggest battle of their lives. And in the quiet Manhattan night, amid the wind whistling through glass towers, something new began to take shape. True understanding forged in regret, forgiveness, and shared purpose. 8 a.m. the next morning. The boardroom of Mediscan Technologies. Margaret had called an emergency meeting. The entire senior leadership team sat around the long wooden table, faces tense as bowstrings pulled too tight. Everyone knew that in 6 hours the merger meeting would begin, the one that might save or sink the company. Marcus Hale, executive vice president, 58, silver hair slicked back, spoke first. "Margaret, we need clarity." "Where's the professional interpreter you hired?" Margaret replied crisply. "I'd like to introduce James Wilson, our lead interpreter for today's merger." She gestured toward the door. James entered in his navy suit, shoulders squared, steps firm. There was no trace left of the chauffeur he had once appeared to be. Every eye around the table followed him, doubt written plainly on their faces. David Williams, the CTO. 45 narrowed his eyes. "Wait a second, isn't he your driver?" The air crackled with tension. Marcus tapped his fingers on the table. "Margaret, this is a $1.2 billion deal. We need verified experts, not someone from..." Margaret's tone turned icy. "From the parking garage." "Go on, Marcus." Marcus swallowed uncomfortably. "It's about optics credibility. The Japanese expect a certain level of professionalism." Susan Walsh, marketing director, too, nodded in agreement. "We can't show up with someone who doesn't fit the image." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "What image would that be?" Susan Marcus cut in. "Someone who looks the part, someone they'll respect." Margaret's gaze swept the table. "You're questioning his qualifications," Marcus enunciated carefully. "I'm questioning his fit. We can't bet everything on someone we barely know." James spoke calm and measured. "Mr. Hale, what exactly are your concerns regarding Japanese business etiquette?" Marcus straightened, slightly uneasy. "Well, cultural nuances, business protocol, gift-giving, bowing, seating arrangements." James nodded gently. "Ah, you're referring to homage, the appropriate bow angle for executive rank. Enza Seki seating by company founding year rather than revenue." "Correct." The room fell dead silent. James continued, still composed. "Nakamura's family company was founded in 1952 during post-war reconstruction. They'll expect gifts that acknowledge their family's contribution to Japan's recovery, not expensive ones that imply we're trying to buy influence. Marcus's jaw nearly dropped. And Singh Holdings follows the Anglo-Indian business style: direct communication, minimal ceremony, absolute punctuality. Mrs. Singh will see elaborate gift exchanges as a waste of time. James looked around the room, voice steady and controlled. The key is balancing both without causing offense. Silence lingered. Then David Williams suddenly switched to French, clearly testing him. "So you claim to be fluent in French," James replied instantly, flawlessly. No hesitation, no accent. He spoke about patents, partnership structures, legal subtleties, all in impeccable French. David's face paled. Where, where did you study Georgetown, Harvard, and 5 years at the U.S. Embassy in Paris? Marcus still refused to yield. "Fine, you're good with languages, but you worked for us for 3 years as a driver. Why didn't you ever say anything?" The question hung heavy in the air. James looked at Marcus, his eyes holding no anger, only fatigue. "I did, Mr. Hale, many times." He turned to Margaret. "Last year's Seoul, I tried to warn about a translation issue. I was told just drive." Margaret closed her eyes, pained. 6 months ago, Berlin. I knew the problem. I was told no one pays you to think. James's voice carried no bitterness, just truth. So I stopped trying. I chose to believe that one day someone would need exactly what I know. Margaret rose to her feet. Her voice was low, but sharp as glass. "Ladies and gentlemen, for 3 years we've had one of America's most accomplished diplomats in our midst, and we've had him driving me to get coffee." She clicked the remote. The screen lit up with a State Department citation, presidential commendation for preventing the collapse of U.S.-French trade relations 2018. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Next slide, lead negotiator, Asia-Pacific Economic Framework, the very foundation of our international business model. David Williams's face drained of color. Another slide, a letter of recommendation from former Japanese Prime Minister Sato. James Wilson mediated the Okinawa Base Accord in 2020. Susan Walsh stared at the screen, speechless. Margaret closed the laptop, her tone quiet but weighty. "For 3 years we had an asset beyond value, and we used him to drive me to Starbucks." The boardroom fell silent, the weight of collective shame almost tangible. Margaret announced, effective immediately, James Wilson is Senior Vice President of International Relations. Salary $180,000 plus stock options. He reports directly to me. She shut the laptop. Any further questions about Mr. Wilson's qualifications? No one spoke. Good, because he's about to save this company. One by one, the executives approached James, offering apologies. Handshakes, gestures of overdue respect. When the room finally emptied, James turned to Margaret, a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. "Ready, Miss Reynolds." Margaret smiled. The first genuine smile in months. "Ready, Mr. Vice President." 2 p.m. The merger meeting was set for 4 o'clock. James sat in his newly assigned temporary office, a small room on the 40th floor with a window facing east, where the midday light filtered through Manhattan's glass towers. He was reviewing documents one last time when his phone vibrated. Unknown number, Boston area code. James Wilson speaking. A voice on the other end spoke rapidly, panicked in French. "Wilson, c'est Kumar qui parle. Division de Boston. Kumar Sharma, Boston Regional Director of Metascan." James had heard his voice hundreds of times in calls that had floated through the car when he was still behind the wheel. "Monsieur Kumar, qu'est-ce qui se passe?" James switched to fluent French. Kumar explained quickly. A rival company had attempted to breach the AI system at the Boston branch. Fortunately, the tech team had detected it in time, but they needed urgent legal authorization to implement countermeasures. Worse, Priya Singh, CEO of Singh Holdings, Metascan's key merger partner, was also in Boston. If she heard about the breach before the meeting, the deal could collapse. James glanced at the clock. 2:15 p.m. "Monsieur Kumar, ne vous inquiétez pas. Je vais m'en occuper tout de suite." "Don't worry, I'll handle it right now." For the next 20 minutes, James coordinated crisis management over the phone. He spoke French with Kumar, English with the legal team in New York, and German with the engineers in Munich, where the cloud servers were hosted. His voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had managed international crises for 2 decades. Margaret opened the door, about to ask something, then froze. She watched James speaking French into the phone, typing English on his laptop, and taking notes in German simultaneously. The sight rooted her in place, one thought echoing in her mind. This is the man I once called a gorilla. Regret washed through her like a tidal wave. James ended the call and turned to Margaret. The Boston branch was targeted by a rival company. It's handled. Which rival? Data Health? San Francisco. They tried to steal the diagnostic algorithm before our deal with Singh is signed. Margaret sank into a chair, face draining of color. If Priya Singh finds out about this. That's exactly why I called her first. Margaret stared at him in disbelief. You called Priya Singh? James nodded calmly. I told her in French, her business language of choice, that Metascan's cybersecurity is stronger than expected. The fact that we detected and blocked the breach within minutes proves the strength of your team. He turned his laptop toward her. With her permission, I joined a video call with Mr. Kumar to finalize the report. Margaret read the final message from Priya Singh. Wilson, your team's response time is impressive. Metascan's security system exceeds our expectations. I look forward to meeting you in person in 2 hours. She looked up, voice trembling. James, you just saved this deal for the second time in 24 hours. James simply shook his head. I didn't save it, Miss Reynolds. Your team did exceptional work. I only made sure the message was delivered the right way. Margaret looked at this man now wearing a perfectly tailored suit, yet still carrying an unshakable humility. Why aren't you prouder of yourself? James smiled faintly, wistfully. I spent 20 years standing behind presidents translating words that could change history. No one knew my name. No one remembered my face. He turned to the window, the afternoon sunlight painting Manhattan in gold. But I knew my work mattered, and for me that was enough. Margaret felt her throat tighten. No, James, that's not enough. You deserve to be seen, to be recognized. He smiled softly. Today I was recognized. By who? Margaret asked. My daughter. James lifted his phone and showed her a message he had just sent. Dear Sarah, good news. I've been promoted. Your med school tuition is fully covered. All 4 years. Focus on becoming the amazing pediatric oncologist I know you will be. The reply flashed almost instantly. Dad, I can't believe it. I love you so much. You're my hero. Margaret covered her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. James stared at the phone, his voice rough with emotion. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't have to lie to my daughter. Margaret's phone buzzed. Richard Morrison, legal counsel. Margaret, the Nakamura Singh delegation just arrived. They're in the lobby at the Four Seasons. They'd like an informal meeting before the official session. Margaret looked at James. Good sign or bad? Good, he replied. They want to gauge your character before negotiating. In Asian cultures, business is personal. James stood straightening his tie. But we need to prepare carefully. They'll be watching everything. How you sit, shake hands, make eye contact. Then teach me, Margaret said firmly. For the next 15 minutes, right there in that small office, James trained her. How to bow to Hiroshi Nakamura, 15 degrees hold, for 3 seconds, no direct eye contact. How to shake hands with Priya Singh, firm grip, steady gaze, no prolonged contact. How to use silence in Japanese negotiations to let them think, not to fill pauses. How to speak to an Anglo-Indian executive, clear, direct, no unnecessary flourishes. And most importantly, James said, resting a hand lightly on her shoulder, a gesture both professional and warm. Remember, they're not just buying your company, they're buying your vision, your sincerity. What if they mention our past about you? Margaret asked quietly. Tell the truth, James replied. That you were wrong and that you're learning to see people differently. In every culture, sincerity earns respect. Margaret nodded, drawing a deep breath. All right, let's go meet them. They walked out side by side, no longer CEO and chauffeur, not just boss and employee, but two warriors about to fight for the fate of 200 people. And in both their hearts, the same quiet vow echoed. We have to win. The Four Seasons hotel lobby radiated old-world luxury, polished marble floors, soaring ceilings, and the faint scent of fresh-cut lilies. James walked slightly behind Margaret, his posture relaxed yet alert, a silent guardian ready to intervene at the first sign of cultural misstep. Through the grand archway of the private reception area, they spotted their targets. Keiichi Nakamura, silver-haired patriarch of Nakamura Technologies, seated beside Priya Singh, the Cambridge-educated CEO of Singh Holdings. Four assistants hovered nearby, each clutching leather portfolios. James leaned close, his breath warm against Margaret's ear. Remember 15-degree bow for Nakamura, hold 3 seconds. Direct eye contact with Singh, but not excessive. Let them speak first. Margaret nodded almost imperceptibly. The stakes pulsed through her veins. $1.2 billion, 200 jobs, her company's survival. One cultural misstep could unravel everything. Nakamura spotted them first. He rose slowly, deliberate, measured movements that signaled his 70 years of business experience. His eyes sharp as obsidian assessed Margaret with frank curiosity. Margaret approached and executed the perfect bow James had taught her, 15 degrees 3 seconds, eyes respectfully lowered. The movement felt foreign to her American sensibilities, but she performed it with unexpected grace. Nakamura-san Mediscan is honored by your presence. The words flowed naturally, free of her usual aggressive corporate tone. Nakamura's weathered face creased with surprise. He returned the bow, matching her depth, precisely a gesture of equals. Reynolds-san, the honor is mutual. James observed the exchange with quiet satisfaction. First hurdle cleared. Priya Singh stepped forward. At 40, she radiated power in her tailored charcoal suit, her handshake firm and direct. Miss Reynolds, I've heard much about you. Some good, some concerning. Margaret felt a slight hesitation, like a warning shot across her bow. She maintained eye contact, neither flinching nor challenging. I imagine you have. I'm working to ensure that future reports tilt firmly toward the positive. Singh's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched upward. A corner of her mouth quirked, not quite a smile, but perhaps the seed of one. We shall see. Tea arrived. The delicate porcelain cups spoke of centuries of tradition. James had briefed Margaret extensively, except with both hands sipped 3 times before business comment on the aroma, but not the taste. She followed each instruction flawlessly, watching as tension gradually melted from Nakamura's shoulders. 20 minutes of carefully orchestrated small talk flowed by whether New York architecture, the merits of various international airports. Nothing of substance, everything of importance. Finally, Nakamura set his cup down with deliberate precision. Reynolds-san, your driver seems unusually qualified. The statement hung in the air, a test balloon sent to gauge reaction. Margaret felt rather than saw James shift slightly behind her. She smiled, not the shark-like grin she typically deployed in negotiations, but something softer, more genuine. Mr. Nakamura, until yesterday I made the grave mistake of seeing James Wilson only as my driver. The truth is, he's one of the most accomplished diplomats the State Department ever produced. Nakamura's eyes widened fractionally. You employed a former State Department official as a driver for 3 years. Margaret met his gaze directly. It was perhaps the most expensive mistake of my career and my greatest opportunity for growth. James watched surprise ripple across Nakamura's features. Priya Singh leaned forward, suddenly interested. Most CEOs would hide such an error. Miss Reynolds, Singh's voice carried a new note, respect tinged with curiosity. Why admit it? Margaret didn't hesitate. Because I believe lasting partnerships are built on honesty, not image management. I was wrong. I'm working to be better. Metascan is working to be better. The silence that followed contained more potential energy than a coiled spring. Nakamura and Singh exchanged glances, an entire conversation passing between them without words. Finally, Nakamura smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his severe features. Reynolds-san, I believe we will have a productive meeting this afternoon. The informal gathering ended with handshakes and bows. As they walked toward the elevator, Margaret felt James's presence beside her, steady as bedrock. That went well. Her whisper barely disturbed the air between them. James nodded, his expression revealing nothing to the other hotel guests passing by. But they're still testing. The real challenge comes at 4. Sunlight spilled across the marble floors as they exited onto Fifth Avenue. Margaret blinked against the sudden brightness. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a crystalline autumn afternoon. They walked in companionable silence for half a block before Margaret spoke. How did you know about the tea ceremony? The bow angles, all of it. James's pace remained steady, his gaze focused ahead. The same way I know many things, Miss Reynolds. I paid attention when others didn't. The words carried no accusation yet. Margaret felt their weight settle on her shoulders. How many other people had she overlooked, ignored, or dismissed? How many voices silenced because they came from unexpected sources? Back at Mediscan headquarters, Margaret's assistant Rebecca waited by the elevator, her tablet clutched like a shield against her chest. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of James walking shoulder to shoulder with Margaret no longer 5 paces behind. The data health breach attempt was contained. Rebecca reported, her words tumbling out rapidly. No data compromised, but there's something else. They're spreading rumors to key financial analysts about our AI diagnostic accuracy rates. The elevator doors slid closed, sealing the three of them inside the rising box. Margaret's knuckles whitened around the handrail. What kind of rumors? Rebecca glanced nervously at James before continuing. They're claiming our melanoma detection algorithm has a 20% false positive rate. 3 analysts have already called for comment. Margaret's stomach clenched. Their algorithm's accuracy was Metascan's crown jewel, the primary reason Nakasing wanted the merger. If investors believed the technology was fundamentally flawed, 20%. James's voice remained calm, but his eyes had narrowed. What's the actual number? Margaret answered automatically. 2.6%, well below industry standard. And has that number been independently verified by Johns Hopkins and Mayo Clinic? James nodded thoughtfully as the elevator reached the executive floor. Then we don't have a rumor problem. We have an opportunity to demonstrate transparency. Rebecca blinked in confusion, but Margaret was already nodding. She'd begun to recognize James's strategic thinking, turning potential disasters into advantages. Rebecca, call a press briefing for tomorrow morning. Invite those analysts. We'll open our verification data and have our lead developers explain our methodology. But Rebecca's protest died on her lips as she registered the new determination in Margaret's eyes. Yes, ma'am. The elevator doors opened to reveal Marcus Hale waiting in the corridor, arms folded across his chest. His silver hair caught the fluorescent lighting, creating a momentary halo effect that contradicted his thunderous expression. Margaret, he hissed, stepping forward to block their path. The board is concerned about Wilson's sudden promotion. Patterson called an emergency meeting for tomorrow. James remained impassive, but Margaret felt a flash of white-hot anger surge through her veins. Edward Patterson was the board chairman, a 70-year-old relic who'd opposed her appointment as CEO 3 years earlier. They can meet all they want after we close this deal, Marcus. Margaret stepped around him, forcing him to pivot awkwardly to maintain eye contact. Until then, we have work to do. Marcus's face flushed crimson. You can't just promote your chauffeur to executive level without board approval. There are protocols, procedures. Margaret stopped so abruptly that Marcus nearly collided with her. Her voice dropped to a register that silenced the entire corridor. When Patterson recruited me to save this company, he gave me full hiring authority for my executive team. Perhaps you'd like to remind him of that detail at tomorrow's meeting? Marcus's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. He resembled nothing so much as a fish suddenly deprived of water. Now, if you'll excuse us, Margaret continued, her tone deceptively pleasant. We're preparing for a meeting that will determine whether you still have a job next week. She swept past him toward the conference room, James following at her side. Rebecca trailed behind, wide-eyed at the confrontation she'd just witnessed. Inside the large conference room, David Williams was already setting up his technical presentation, his fingers flying across his laptop keyboard. He glanced up when they entered, offering a tentative nod to James, the closest thing to an apology his pride would allow. James assessed the room with a diplomat's practiced eye. The digital display at the head of the table showed the contract's most contentious clauses. Printouts of technical specifications littered the polished surface. A cart of refreshments waited in the corner, American coffee, not Japanese tea. He moved swiftly to the refreshment cart, examining its contents. Within seconds, he was on the phone to catering, his voice low but insistent. Margaret watched with fascination as he orchestrated a complete overhaul of the meeting setup based on cultural protocols she'd never considered. 20 minutes later, the room had been transformed. The digital display now showed images of Tokyo's skyline alongside Mumbai's emerging tech corridor. The jarring fluorescent lights had been dimmed in favor of softer illumination. The refreshments had been replaced with a selection that honored both Japanese and Indian preferences, green tea alongside masala chai, traditional wagashi sweets, beside cardamom-infused biscuits. Margaret surveyed the changes with growing appreciation for James's attention to detail. He'd created an environment that signaled respect, without pandering, that acknowledged cultural differences while facilitating business. The technical team arrived next, 6 engineers and developers, who would explain Metascan's proprietary algorithms to the Nakasing delegation. Margaret watched as James introduced himself, immediately establishing rapport with these people who'd previously never looked twice at the man who drove their CEO. He approached one young engineer who clutched a tablet nervously, her hands trembling slightly. "You must be Dr. Patel. I read your paper on neural network applications in diagnostic imaging." "Brilliant work." The woman's eyes widened in surprise. "You read my paper?" James nodded, completely serious. "Your breakthrough on reducing false positives in melanoma detection is precisely what interests the Singh team. They've done similar work in Mumbai." Dr. Patel's posture straightened, confidence replacing anxiety. "Would you like me to explain the technical specifications?" James smiled. "Absolutely, but when you present to Mr. Nakamura, remember that Japanese business culture values the journey as much as the destination. Begin with your initial challenges, not just the solution." Margaret observed the interaction with a strange mixture of pride and shame. James was mentoring her staff, providing insights that would smooth the cultural aspects of the technical presentation. He moved through the room like water, addressing concerns before they became problems, offering suggestions that enhanced rather than criticized. And for 3 years, she had seen him only as the man behind the wheel. As the clock edged toward 3, Margaret called the team together for final preparations. James stood at her side, offering targeted advice on everything from seating arrangements to the precise wording of technical explanations. A sharp knock at the door interrupted their preparations. Rebecca entered, her face pinched with concern. She beckoned Margaret urgently. Margaret stepped into the hallway, James following a half-step behind. Rebecca's voice dropped to a whisper. "I just received a call from Boston. Kumar says there's been another breach attempt, more sophisticated than the first. They're specifically targeting the melanoma algorithm data." Margaret felt ice water replace the blood in her veins. If Data Health accessed those files before the merger signing. James was already on his phone speaking rapid French to Kumar in Boston. The technical details flowed between them: firewall protocols, encryption levels, server redundancies. James asked precise questions that revealed his surprising command of cybersecurity concepts. When he ended the call, his expression remained calm, but Margaret detected the tension around his eyes. They're using a sophisticated attack vector, likely state-sponsored tools. Kumar has contained it for now, but they'll try again. State-sponsored, Margaret's mind raced through implications. Why would a competitor have access to that level of technology? James's voice dropped lower. "Before I left state, there were rumors that Data Health's CEO had connections to foreign intelligence services. Nothing confirmed, but..." He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication hung in the air. This wasn't just corporate espionage, it was potentially something far more serious. "We need to alert federal authorities," Margaret decided. "But after the merger, if this becomes public now, the deal dies." James finished. "And 200 people lose their jobs." Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. "Should I tell Kumar to disconnect the servers?" "Go offline until after the signing." James shook his head. That would raise immediate red flags with Nakasingh's technical team. He paused, then reached a decision. "Give me 2 minutes." He stepped aside, placed another call, speaking in such hushed tones that neither woman could make out the words. When he returned, a new confidence radiated from his stance. "I've contacted a former colleague at the State Department's Cybersecurity Division. They'll monitor the situation quietly and intervene if necessary." Margaret's eyebrows shot upward. "You still have those connections?" James's lips quirked in a half-smile. "People remember those who helped them, Miss Reynolds. I saved that man's career 15 years ago in Brussels. He hasn't forgotten." The simple statement carried volumes about the man she'd so thoroughly underestimated. While she'd been building her empire on fear and intimidation, James had constructed his on mutual respect and genuine assistance. They returned to the conference room where the team awaited final instructions. Margaret addressed them with a newfound humility that surprised even herself. "Everyone, we've encountered some additional challenges, but nothing we can't handle. I need your absolute best today. Not for me, not for your bonuses, but for each other, for the 200 families that depend on this company." The room fell silent. Many had never heard Margaret speak in such terms before. Gone was the threatening undertone, the implicit warning of consequences for failure. In its place stood a leader asking her people to rise to an occasion. I've made mistakes, she continued. I've created a culture of fear rather than achievement. That changes today. She gestured toward James, who stood quietly by her side. For 3 years, we had one of America's most accomplished diplomats driving me to Starbucks. That's not just my failure, it's evidence of a company that stops seeing people as people. After today, that company no longer exists. The tension in the room transformed, morphing from anxiety into something approaching determination. Margaret felt it, the subtle shift of energy that occurs when people move from working for a paycheck to working for a purpose. James said up and forward, Naka Singh isn't just buying our technology. They're buying us our knowledge, our creativity, our ability to innovate. Show them who we really are. The team dispersed to their final preparations with a new energy. Margaret turned to James, her voice pitched for his ears alone. Did you really make a call to the State Department? James nodded. Thomas Freeman, Deputy Director of Cyber Operations. We worked together in Brussels during the EU treaty negotiations, and he agreed to help just like that. Not just like that, I promised him dinner at Peter Luger next time he's in New York. His wife loves their steak. Margaret couldn't suppress a smile. The enormity of what they faced, corporate espionage, possibly state-sponsored, contrasted with the simple human solution of dinner and steak. You've spent your life building bridges while I've been burning them, she realized aloud. James regarded her thoughtfully. Different approaches for different times, Miss Reynolds. You built this company through force of will. That's no small achievement. But at what cost? The whispered question emerged before she could stop it, a moment of vulnerability she would never have allowed herself 24 hours earlier. James's response carried no judgment, only quiet wisdom. That's the question we all face eventually. The good news is, you're asking it while there's still time to adjust the answer. A knock at the door prevented further conversation. Rebecca entered, her expression tense despite her efforts to appear calm. They're here. Margaret drew a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. Show them to the conference room. We're ready. James touched her elbow lightly, a gesture of support that somehow steadied her more than any pep talk could have. Remember, Nakamura will take your measure in the first 30 seconds. Don't rush to fill silence. Let them set the pace. She nodded, suddenly grateful beyond words for his presence. The Naka Singh delegation entered with the precision of a practiced orchestra, 12 people moving in perfect harmony, arranged by rank and function. Keiichi Nakamura led, followed by Priya Singh. Behind them came their respective technical and legal teams, each carrying identical leather portfolios embossed with their company logos. Margaret stepped forward, performing the bow James had taught her with fluid grace. Nakamura-san, Singh-san, welcome to Mediscan. We are honored by your presence. The formal greeting set the tone for what followed, a carefully choreographed dance of business and culture. James stood at Margaret's right hand, translating complex technical terms when necessary, but more importantly, translating cultural nuances that might otherwise have derailed the proceedings. When David Williams began his technical presentation on the melanoma detection algorithm, James subtly adjusted the engineer's typically blunt delivery. The Japanese delegation nodded appreciatively as Williams described the journey of development rather than immediately jumping to results, exactly as James had advised. An hour into the meeting, Margaret noticed Priya Singh watching James with undisguised interest. During a brief break, the Indian executive approached him directly. Mr. Wilson, your Japanese is impeccable. Where did you study? Tokyo University, 1998 to 2000. James's reply was modest, understated. Singh's eyebrows rose. The diplomatic exchange program. That was highly competitive. James nodded. I was fortunate to be selected. Then you must know Rajiv Patel. He was part of the Indian contingent during those years. James smiled recognition, lighting his features. Of course. Brilliant man. He introduced me to proper chai and ruined me for American tea forever. Singh laughed, a genuine sound that transformed her typically stern countenance. He's my uncle. I'll tell him we met. He'll be delighted. Margaret observed the exchange with fascination. In less than a minute, James had established a personal connection that might prove invaluable to the negotiations. He hadn't name-dropped or forced the relationship, it had emerged naturally from shared experience. The meeting resumed. Technical specifications were reviewed, legal terms debated. Through it all, James facilitated understanding, smoothing potential conflicts before they could erupt. When Nakamura's legal counsel raised concerns about intellectual property protections, James suggested a compromise that honored Japanese corporate traditions while protecting Metascan's innovations. 3 hours passed in what felt like minutes. The room's energy remained focused productive. Margaret found herself watching James as much as the delegates. The subtle nods that encouraged her to continue a point, the slight head shakes that warned her away from potential pitfalls. Then came the moment she'd been dreading. Nakamura cleared his throat, his expression serious. Reynolds-san, our technical team has heard concerning reports about your melanoma detection algorithm, claims of a 20% false positive rate. The room fell silent. Margaret felt every eye turn toward her. A single drop of sweat traced its way down her spine. She caught James's gaze. He nodded almost imperceptibly, a gesture that conveyed complete confidence in her. Mr. Nakamura, Margaret began, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart, those reports are categorically false. Our algorithm has been independently verified by both Johns Hopkins and Mayo Clinic. The actual false positive rate is 2.6%. She didn't stop there. Instead of becoming defensive, she opened her laptop and brought up the verification data. Rather than attempting to hide potential weaknesses, she displayed them alongside the solutions her team had developed. We believe in absolute transparency, she continued. That's why we've prepared complete access to our verification protocols for your technical team. We're not perfect, but we're honest about our limitations and committed to overcoming them. Nakamura studied her face, searching for signs of deception. Finding none, he turned to his technical lead, who nodded confirmation after reviewing the displayed data. The tension in the room dissipated like morning fog under strong sunlight. The meeting continued, but something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer potential adversaries seeking advantage, but partners exploring possibility. At 6 o'clock, when the formal discussions concluded, Nakamura did something unexpected. He approached Margaret, directly bypassing the usual filters of assistants and legal teams. Reynolds-san, my son, is visiting from Tokyo. He has reservations at Masa tonight at 8. Priya and I would be honored if you and Mr. Wilson would join us, not for business, but for friendship. The invitation represented far more than dinner. In Japanese business culture, such a personal gesture indicated genuine interest in long-term partnership. Margaret glanced at James, who gave a slight nod of confirmation. We would be delighted, Mr. Nakamura. After the delegation departed, the Metascan team remained in stunned silence. The meeting had exceeded their most optimistic projections. The preliminary agreement had been initialed, with final signatures scheduled for tomorrow morning. 200 jobs saved. A company pulled back from the brink of collapse. David Williams was the first to speak, his typically reserved demeanor cracking with excitement. I've never seen anything like it. They actually liked us. The simple observation broke the tension. Laughter rippled through the room, the slightly hysterical release that follows extreme stress. Margaret raised her hand, quieting the celebration. None of this would have happened without James Wilson. She turned toward him, public acknowledgement replacing 3 years of dismissal. Thank you, James, not just for today, but for every day you continued to excel despite how you were treated. The room erupted in applause. James accepted it with characteristic grace, neither minimizing his contribution nor claiming undue credit. When the noise subsided, he addressed the team. I observed something remarkable today. When given the chance to be your authentic selves, brilliant creative problem solvers you've shown, remember that feeling. It's the true culture of Metascan. The team dispersed, energized by success and validation. Margaret remained behind, with James suddenly aware that they had a formal dinner to attend in less than 2 hours. I need to go home and change, she realized aloud. I can't wear the same suit I've been in all day. James nodded. I should do the same. My apartment is in Queens. Shall I meet you at the restaurant? The mention of his home reminded Margaret how little she knew about his life outside work. For 3 years, he had driven her everywhere, waiting patiently while she attended meetings, dinners, events. Not once had she considered his commute, his living situation, his personal time. I'll have the company car take you home and pick you up. It's the least I can do, James smiled. That would be appreciated. Thank you. As they walked toward the elevator, Margaret's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The screen displayed Emma, her daughter, calling from Phillips Exeter. Her finger hovered over the decline button, her typical response when work demanded attention. Then she stopped, remembering her promise to change. Excuse me, James. I need to take this. She stepped aside, answering with a warmth that had been absent from her voice for too long. Emma, sweetheart, how are you? The voice that replied carried the unmistakable sound of teenage tears. Mom, I got a C on my history paper. Mr. Brennan said my analysis was shallow and predictable. Once Margaret would have responded with criticism disguised as motivation. Instead, she found herself channeling the patience she'd witnessed in James all day. I'm sorry, honey. That must have been disappointing after all your hard work. A sniffle came through the line. You're not mad. Margaret felt a pang of regret so acute it was almost physical. Why would I be mad about a single grade? You're more than your academic performance, Emma. The silence that followed spoke volumes about how rarely she had expressed such sentiments. Mom, are you okay? You sound different. Margaret glanced at James, who stood a respectful distance away, giving her privacy while remaining available. I am different, sweetie. Or trying to be. We'll talk more about it when you come home this weekend, okay? After they disconnected, Margaret rejoined James at the elevator. He said nothing about the call respecting her privacy, but she felt compelled to explain anyway. My daughter, she's 14 at Phillips Exeter. James nodded. Sarah went through a difficult phase at that age too. After her mother died, she struggled with academics for almost a year. The casual mention of his late wife caught Margaret off guard. She'd never considered his personal losses the challenges he'd faced as a single parent. How did you help her through it? The elevator arrived, doors sliding open with a soft chime. James stepped inside, his reflection multiplied in the mirrored walls. I listened more than I spoke, validated her feelings instead of trying to fix them, and reminded her that I loved her, regardless of grades or achievements. Such simple wisdom, yet it stood in stark contrast to Margaret's typical approach, with Emma demanding excellence, dismissing emotions as weakness, treating anything less than perfection as failure. They descended in companionable silence. When they reached the lobby, Margaret made a decision. James, after dinner tonight, I'd like your input on something more personal than business. He tilted his head questioningly. I need to rebuild my relationship with my daughter. I think you might have insights that could help. James's expression softened. It would be my privilege, Miss Reynolds. For the first time, his use of her formal title struck her as incongruous. Please call me Margaret. A small smile played across his features. Margaret, then. They parted ways in the lobby, agreeing to meet at Masa at 8. As Margaret settled into the back seat of the company car, the same vehicle where yesterday she had hurled insults at the man who would save her company, she felt a strange sense of lightness. Something was shifting within her, foundations crumbling, yes, but making way for something stronger, more sustainable. The Margaret Reynolds who had entered that car yesterday was not the same woman who sat in it now. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. Board Chairman Patterson insisting on briefing before tomorrow's signing, says it's urgent. Margaret stared at the message, feeling the familiar surge of stress threatening to overwhelm her newfound perspective. Edward Patterson represented everything she'd been fighting against for years: old money, old connections, old thinking. His opposition to her leadership had been thinly veiled from the start. She began to type her usual defensive response, then stopped. What would James do in this situation? The answer came with surprising clarity. He would build a bridge instead of a wall. She deleted her initial reply and wrote instead, happy to brief him. Schedule call for 7:15 a.m. before the 9 a.m. signing. We'll have Wilson join to answer any cultural questions. Turning conflict into cooperation, treating even adversaries with professional respect. These were the lessons James had been silently teaching her for 3 years, lessons she had been too arrogant to learn. The car pulled up to her Upper East Side townhouse. Margaret entered the empty space, a showcase of expensive design rather than a true home. Emma's school photos smiled from sterling silver frames, but little else suggested a teenager lived here part-time. No scattered textbooks, no abandoned sneakers, no evidence of messy adolescent existence. Margaret moved through rooms that echoed with absence. When had she decided that perfection mattered more than presence? When had she transformed from the daughter of a Brooklyn construction worker into someone who valued appearance over substance? She showered and changed into an elegant black dress, appropriate for dinner at one of New York's most exclusive restaurants. As she fastened her grandmother's pearl necklace, the only inheritance from her hardworking family, her phone chimed with a text from Emma. Thanks for understanding about the paper, Mom. Love you. 5 simple words that meant more than any business deal ever could. At 7:45, the company car arrived at a modest apartment building in Astoria, Queens. James emerged wearing a charcoal suit that, while not designer labeled, displayed impeccable taste. He carried himself with the same quiet dignity, whether in a chauffeur's uniform or formal attire. The 20-minute drive to the restaurant passed in comfortable silence, both lost in thought about the remarkable day behind them and the significant evening ahead. Masa occupied a rarefied position in New York's culinary hierarchy, a small, exclusive restaurant where dinner for four could easily exceed $2,000. The intimate space featured natural materials and subdued lighting designed to focus attention on the exquisite food rather than showy decor. Nakamura and Singh were already seated when they arrived, along with the Nakamura's son Takeo, a 30-something executive with his father's shrewd eyes and a more Western sensibility shaped by education at Stanford. Introductions flowed smoothly, facilitated by James's cultural expertise. Margaret noted how he adjusted his body language, subtly depending on which person he addressed, more formal with the elder Nakamura, more contemporary with Takeo, elegantly precise with Singh. Wine was poured, appetizers appeared, and conversation began to flow. Business remained tactfully unmentioned, following the Japanese principle of establishing personal connections before professional commitments. Takeo leaned forward, addressing James directly. "My father tells me you lived in Tokyo. What district? Akasaka, near the embassy. But I spent most weekends exploring Asakusa Ueno Yanaka." Takeo's expression brightened. "Yanaka. My grandmother lived there. All those tiny streets, traditional shops. An elderly man delivers fresh tofu every morning, calling out with a melody unchanged for 50 years. James continued, slipping briefly into Japanese to mimic the distinctive call. Takeo laughed with delight. Most tourists never discover those neighborhoods." The conversation shifted effortlessly between topics: architecture, food, literature, travel. Margaret found herself captivated by James's depth of knowledge, the richness of his experiences. Had all this been there silently riding in her car for 3 years, Priya Singh directed a question toward Margaret. "You've engineered quite a transformation at Metascan. What drove you to healthcare AI specifically?" The question seemed innocent, but Margaret recognized it as a gentle probe into her motivations, her authenticity. Once she would have responded with rehearsed corporate language about market opportunities and growth potential. Instead, she found herself answering with unexpected honesty. "My father died of skin cancer that was diagnosed too late. He was a construction worker, spent his life outdoors without understanding the risks. By the time doctors caught it, the melanoma had metastasized." She felt rather than saw James's attention shift toward her. This was information he hadn't known, personal history she typically kept hidden behind her corporate facade. "I originally wanted to become a dermatologist," she continued, "but medical school wasn't financially feasible after he died. So I channeled that energy into building technology that could help doctors catch what my father's missed." The table fell silent. Singh regarded her with new interest, reassessing the woman she thought she knew. Takeo nodded with obvious respect. The elder Nakamura studied her face before speaking. "Purpose born of personal pain creates the strongest foundations, Reynolds-san. My own company began after my brother died from radiation sickness in Nagasaki. Every innovation we've created stems from that loss." Margaret felt something shift in the atmosphere, a deeper connection forming beyond business compatibility. For the first time in years, she had revealed her true motivation rather than a calculated image, and it had strengthened rather than weakened her position. The evening progressed through multiple courses of Chef Masa's renowned cuisine. James provided subtle guidance when necessary: which fish could be eaten with fingers, how to properly appreciate the wasabi grated tableside, when to compliment the chef directly. By the time dessert arrived, delicate wagashi sweets paired with ceremonial matcha, the dinner had transformed from a business obligation into a genuine connection between like-minded individuals. As they prepared to depart, Nakamura addressed Margaret with newfound warmth. "Reynolds-san, look forward to tomorrow's signing with great anticipation. Our companies will achieve remarkable things together." The words represented far more than business platitudes. They were a personal endorsement, the highest currency in Japanese business culture. Outside the restaurant, after the Naka Singh group had departed in their waiting cars, Margaret turned to James. The depth of gratitude she felt couldn't be adequately expressed in words. "I don't know how to thank you for today." James smiled gently. "You already have by listening, by learning, by seeing people clearly. That's all anyone truly wants." The company car waited at the curb. For the first time in 3 years, Margaret hesitated before entering the back seat. Instead, she opened the front passenger door. "May I join you? The drive to your place? First, then mine." James appeared momentarily surprised, then nodded. Of course, they settled into the front seats together, a symbolic reconfiguration of their relationship. As the car pulled away from the curb, Margaret realized she still had so many questions about the man beside her. "Tell me about Sarah, your daughter. How did she decide to become a doctor?" James's expression softened at the mention of his child. Sarah was 12 when her mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. During the treatments, one oncologist in particular showed extraordinary compassion, not just medical skill, but true empathy. He would explain everything to Sarah directly, never talking down to her, despite her age. The car navigated through Manhattan's evening traffic, a journey they had made hundreds of times, but never quite like this, sitting side by side, engaging as equals. After Catherine died, James continued. Sarah announced she would become a doctor like Dr. Abramson. She never wavered from that goal, not once in 10 years. The quiet pride in his voice touched something deep within Margaret. She found herself thinking of Emma, her artistic talent, her empathetic nature qualities. Margaret had often dismissed as impractical in the cutthroat world she inhabited. Does it get easier raising a child alone? James considered the question with his characteristic thoughtfulness. Not easier exactly. The challenges just evolve. In the early years after Catherine died, it was about managing grief, hers and mine simultaneously. Later, it became about maintaining connection through adolescence. Now it's about supporting her dreams while letting her forge her own path. He glanced at Margaret. Emma is 14, right? That's a critical age, needing both guidance and independence in constantly shifting measure. Margaret nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by how much she had missed in her daughter's life while building her corporate empire. "I've been so focused on giving her opportunities that I forgot to give her me." James's response carried no judgment, only gentle wisdom. "It's never too late to change the relationship, Margaret. Teenagers are remarkably forgiving when they sense genuine effort." The car turned onto his street in Astoria, a quiet neighborhood of modest apartment buildings and small family-owned businesses. Before he could exit, Margaret touched his arm lightly. "James, would you consider something beyond your new role as SVP?" He waited, questioning. "Emma is coming home this weekend. Would you join us for dinner Sunday night? Help me learn how to really talk with my daughter." The request revealed more vulnerability than Margaret had shown anyone in years. James recognized the courage it required. "I'd be honored, Margaret. Truly." As they said goodnight and the car continued toward her Upper East Side home, Margaret felt an unfamiliar emotion spreading through her chest, not the adrenaline rush of corporate victory or the smug satisfaction of outmaneuvering opponents, but something warmer, more sustainable. It took her several minutes to identify it, this feeling that had become so foreign to her existence. Hope, not just for her company's survival, but for her own. Morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Mediscan Technologies boardroom. The polished walnut table gleamed under the crystalline light, reflecting the nervous energy of those gathered around it. 7 o'clock, and already the space hummed with anticipation. Margaret stood at the head of the table, phone pressed to her ear, her free hand gesturing for the others to take their seats. Behind her, a digital screen displayed the final contract pages ready for electronic signatures that would determine the fate of 200 employees. No, Edward, there was no impropriety in Wilson's promotion. His qualifications exceed the position requirements. The merger signing proceeds as scheduled at 9. Edward Patterson's voice crackled through the speaker, audible to everyone despite Margaret's attempt to keep the call private. His aristocratic Boston accent dripped with condescension. "The board has concerns, Margaret. Serious concerns about your judgment lately." Margaret caught James's eye across the room. He gave an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. "If the board has concerns," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the provocation, "they're welcome to review today's success after we secure the $2 billion that will save this company. My judgment delivered those results. I'll expect your congratulations by noon." She ended the call before Patterson could respond, a maneuver she would never have attempted before yesterday. Leadership through intimidation had been her standard approach with the board. This direct but respectful firmness felt foreign, yet strangely liberating. The technical team filed in, followed by the legal department. Last to arrive were Marcus Hale and Susan Walsh, both looking distinctly uncomfortable. They'd been among the most vocal critics of James's promotion yesterday. Now facing the imminent success of the strategy, they'd opposed. Their expressions fluctuated between relief and chagrin. Rebecca distributed tablets containing the morning's agenda. Each screen displayed the same message at the top: Naka Singh merger signing, 9 Huzru AM. Prosperity through partnership. On the phrase had been James's suggestion, acknowledging both Japanese and Indian cultural values in 6 simple words. Margaret surveyed the assembled team. Everyone, thank you for your extraordinary work yesterday. Today we finalize what you've made possible. She gestured toward James, standing unobtrusively at her right hand. For those who haven't heard, we have additional security concerns this morning. Mr. Wilson's contacts at the State Department have confirmed our suspicions. Data Health's attacks were more than typical corporate espionage. James stepped forward, his demeanor shifting subtly from diplomatic advisor to security expert. We've received intelligence that Data Health contracted with former military hackers based out of Eastern Europe. Their target appears to be our melanoma detection algorithm, though their ultimate objective remains unclear. The room tensed. David Williams spoke up, his earlier skepticism about James now completely absent. Is the signing in jeopardy? James shook his head. Federal cybersecurity teams are monitoring our networks. We've implemented additional protections overnight. The merger proceeds as planned, but with heightened vigilance. Rebecca raised her hand tentatively. Should we inform the Naka Singh delegation? Margaret and James exchanged glances. Margaret answered, transparency has served us well so far. James will brief Nakamura and Singh privately before the signing. No dramatic announcements, just professional disclosure of a managed situation. The team nodded collectively, accepting the decision. The atmosphere in the room had transformed since yesterday. Margaret's leadership no longer questioned, James's expertise no longer dismissed. What had taken 3 years to destroy had somehow been rebuilt in 24 hours. Margaret continued positions for the signing ceremony, legal teams flanking the principal's technical advisors in the second row. We'll use the ceremonial pens engraved with both company logos. As the team dispersed to make final preparations, Margaret turned to James. The last 14 hours had aged him fine lines at the corners of his eyes, deepened by stress and minimal sleep. Yet he stood ready, posture perfect, mind alert. How are you holding up? The genuine concern in her voice surprised even herself. James offered a tired smile. I've negotiated peace treaties on less sleep, Margaret. I'll be fine. She hesitated, then asked the question that had kept her awake much of the night. The cybersecurity threat, James, how serious is it really? His expression remained neutral, but she'd learned to read the subtle tightening around his eyes. Serious enough that my contact bypassed normal channels to warn me. Data Health isn't just trying to steal our technology. They're attempting to compromise it during the signing itself. Fear flickered through Margaret's chest. They want the deal to collapse. More than that, James lowered his voice further. They want the technology to fail catastrophically during implementation. Maximum damage to both companies. The implications struck Margaret like physical blows. 200 Mediscan jobs lost. Naka Singh's reputation damaged internationally. And most devastating, thousands of potential cancer patients deprived of life-saving early detection. Does your contact have a plan? James nodded. They're tracking the attack source. But our best defense remains completing this merger. Once the contracts are signed, Data Health loses any leverage. Margaret squared her shoulders, decision made. Then we proceed exactly as planned. No delays, no last-minute changes. Nothing to give Data Health an opening. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Rebecca entered, tablet clutched against her chest. Nakamura-san and Singh-san have arrived. They're requesting a private meeting before the signing. Margaret felt momentary panic fluttered in her stomach. Had they somehow learned of the security threat? Were they reconsidering? James read her expression perfectly. Standard procedure, he reassured her. They'll want to confirm final details without staff present. It's actually a good sign. Show them to my office, Rebecca. We'll join them immediately. Margaret's corner office, with its sweeping Manhattan views, had been transformed overnight. Gone were the stark, minimalist furnishings that had previously dominated the space. In their place stood a careful blend of east and west comfortable seating arranged for conversation rather than confrontation, subtle lighting that highlighted natural elements, fresh orchids selected for their significance in both Japanese and Indian cultures. James had orchestrated these changes through the night, understanding intuitively that environmental details would reinforce the partnership's foundation. Nakamura and Singh rose when Margaret and James entered. The formal bows and handshakes of yesterday had evolved into warmer greetings, evidence of the personal connections established during dinner. Nakamura's expression, however, carried a seriousness that immediately set Margaret on alert. Reynolds-san, before we proceed with the signing, there is a matter requiring discussion. Margaret maintained her composure, though her heart accelerated. Of course, Nakamura-san. Please share your concerns. Nakamura exchanged glances with Singh before continuing. Our security teams detected unusual activity targeting your systems overnight. Very sophisticated, very persistent. James stepped forward smoothly. Nakamura-san, Singh-san, we were preparing to brief you on this very matter. We've identified Data Health as the source of these attacks and have implemented countermeasures with federal assistance. Singh's eyebrows rose slightly. You're aware of the situation? Margaret nodded. Full transparency was our intention, though we wanted to present the information with proper context. The attacks pose no risk to our technology or its implementation. The statement contained more confidence than Margaret actually felt, but projecting certainty had become second nature over years of leadership. Nakamura studied her face, searching for deception. Finding none, his expression softened. Your candor is appreciated, Reynolds-san. In my experience, problems concealed always return multiplied. The tension in the room dissipated like morning mist under rising sun. Singh leaned forward, her businesslike demeanor returning. Since we're speaking frankly, there's one additional matter to address before signing. Margaret braced herself for another challenge. The executive who will oversee integration of our companies. Singh continued. We've reviewed your organization chart, but none of your current team possesses the cultural and technical expertise required. The unspoken implication hung in the air. Margaret glanced at James, who maintained a carefully neutral expression. We've been discussing this very issue, Margaret replied. In fact, I'd like to propose someone who I believe meets all requirements. Singh and Nakamura waited expectantly. James Wilson? Margaret gestured toward him with newfound confidence. His diplomatic experience, language fluency, and technical knowledge make him uniquely qualified to manage the integration process. James blinked genuine surprise, crossing his features before he regained his professional composure. This wasn't something they had discussed. Nakamura nodded thoughtfully. Wilson-san would be acceptable to us. His understanding of our cultures has already proven valuable. Singh agreed, though her analytical mind sought practical details. Would this be in addition to his new role as Senior Vice President of International Relations? Margaret had been improvising, but now the pieces fell into place. The title would be Executive Vice President of Strategic Integration, reporting directly to the Joint Leadership Council. The position would oversee the merger implementation for the first 18 months. James remained silent, his diplomatic training preventing any outward reaction to this unexpected development. But Margaret could read the subtle shift in his posture, surprise giving way to consideration. Nakamura and Singh exchanged glances, a wordless communication passing between them. Both nodded in agreement. The matter is settled then, Nakamura pronounced. We may proceed with the signing. As they walked toward the boardroom where the signing ceremony would take place, James moved close to Margaret's side. Executive Vice President, this wasn't in our preparation. Margaret smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her typically serious features. Yesterday you taught me to see potential where others don't. I'm just following your example. The boardroom had filled with essential personnel from both companies, witnesses to the historic merger. Cameras had been set up to record the signing for internal documentation. The atmosphere hummed with nervous anticipation. Marcus Hale approached as Margaret entered, his expression unreadable. Margaret, may I have a word before we begin? She nodded, stepping aside with her executive vice president. What is it? Marcus Hale's voice dropped to a near whisper. Patterson is furious about Wilson's promotion. He's rallying board members for an emergency session this afternoon. Once this news would have sent Margaret into defensive maneuvers, perhaps even prompted her to reconsider her decisions. Now she simply nodded, absorbing the information without allowing it to derail her focus. The board is welcome to meet. Today we're saving 200 jobs and securing Mediscan's future. If Patterson can't recognize that achievement, perhaps it's time to reevaluate his position as chairman. Marcus's eyes widened at her calm defiance. He'll try to force a confidence vote, then he'll fail, Margaret replied with quiet certainty. Now shall we make history? She moved to the center of the room where two ceremonial chairs had been positioned at the signing table. Nakamura took his place to her right, Singh to her left. James stood directly behind Margaret, a living symbol of the bridge between cultures that had made this moment possible. The room quieted as Margaret began the formal address. Today marks not merely a business transaction, but the birth of a new vision for healthcare technology. Naka Singh and Mediscan unite with a single purpose to create diagnostic tools that save lives across cultural and geographical boundaries. Her words carried none of the corporate jargon that had characterized her previous speeches. Instead, she spoke from a place of authentic purpose, describing the human impact of their combined technologies. When she finished, Nakamura rose to deliver his remarks in Japanese, which James translated with perfect nuance. Then Singh spoke her precise British accented English, requiring no interpretation, but benefiting from James's subtle cultural contextualization for the Japanese contingent. The signing itself proceeded with ceremonial precision. Pages turned pens, scratched against premium paper signatures accumulated. With each completed section, the tension in the room gradually dissipated, replaced by growing excitement. As Margaret signed the final page and passed it to Nakamura, she caught James's eye. His expression remained professionally neutral, but she detected a glimmer of something deeper pride, perhaps not in his own accomplishments, but in hers. In this moment of corporate triumph, his focus remained human-centered, measuring success not in dollars, but in lives affected. The final signature complete, Nakamura raised his hand to signal the momentous occasion. A ripple of applause began quickly swelling into enthusiastic celebration. 200 jobs secured, life-saving technology preserved and enhanced, a future reclaimed from the brink of disaster. Champagne appeared a Western tradition that both Japanese and Indian partners accepted with good humor. Glasses clinked, congratulations flowed. Margaret found herself at the center of a swirl of well-wishers, including executives who had questioned her judgment just 24 hours earlier. She extricated herself from the crowd to find James standing quietly near the window, observing the celebration rather than participating in it. His natural inclination, she realized, was to facilitate others' success without claiming credit. We did it. She joined him at the window where Manhattan stretched below them, oblivious to the corporate drama that had just concluded 92 floors above. You did it, James corrected gently. I merely helped navigate cultural waters. Margaret shook her head, unwilling to accept his self-effacement. Neither of us could have achieved this alone, James. That's the lesson I needed to learn. Before he could respond, Rebecca approached with urgent purpose. Margaret, we've just received word from Boston. There's been another cyber attack much larger than previous attempts. Kumar says federal agents have arrived at the facility. James immediately reached for his phone, stepping away to make calls. Margaret turned to Rebecca. Has anything been compromised? No, but Kumar says they're targeting a completely different system now. Patient data files rather than the diagnostic algorithm. The strategic shift alarmed Margaret more than the attack itself. Data Health had abandoned their attempts to damage the technology and moved to something potentially more damaging: patient privacy. James returned, his expression grave. The attack originated from servers in Belarus, but they've been shut down remotely by federal agents. My contact believes this was a desperate final attempt after news of the signing reached Data Health. Margaret processed this information, considering implications and next steps. Have cybersecurity lock down all patient records as a precaution. Double authentication for the next 72 hours. And prepare a statement for regulatory agencies will self-report the attempt, even though no breach occurred. Rebecca nodded, impressed by Margaret's command of security protocols that would have been delegated without personal attention in the past. As Rebecca departed to implement these measures, Margaret turned back to James. Why target patient data after the signing? The merger can't be undone now. James considered the question with his characteristic thoroughness. They're shifting from prevention to punishment. If they can't stop the merger, They'll attempt to damage Mediscan's reputation through privacy violations. The corporate brutality of the approach struck Margaret anew. 200 families had nearly lost their livelihoods because a rival company coveted technology that saved lives. The human cost of business had never been more apparent. A new thought occurred to her, one that would never have surfaced in her previous mindset. We should warn other companies in our sector. If data health would target us this aggressively, they might go after smaller firms with fewer protections. James studied her face, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. You're thinking beyond competitive advantage to sector-wide security. That's refreshing. Margaret felt warmth rise in her cheeks at the simple compliment, more meaningful coming from James than any business award she'd received. The revelation startled her. When had his good opinion become so important? The celebration continued around them, but Margaret found her thoughts drifting toward the afternoon's challenges. Patterson's board meeting, integration planning, security protocols. The merger signing represented not an ending, but a beginning with complex implementation work ahead. As if reading her thoughts, James spoke softly. One victory at a time, Margaret. This moment deserves your presence before you tackle the next battle. His gentle redirection brought her back to the present, to the accomplishment they had achieved together, to the jobs saved, to the lives that would be improved through the combined technologies. You're right, she raised her champagne glass, to seeing people for who they really are. James touched his glass to hers. And to becoming who we're meant to be. The simple toast contained layers of meaning that resonated between them, acknowledging both her journey of self-discovery and his emergence from the shadows of underestimation. The celebration gradually wound down as executives returned to their regular duties, energized by success, but aware of ongoing responsibilities. The Nakasing delegation departed for their hotel with plans to return the following day for initial integration meetings. By early afternoon, Margaret and James found themselves alone in her office, reviewing Patterson's formal notification of an emergency board meeting scheduled for 4 o'clock. James studied the document. Patterson's playing his last card. The meeting's timing immediately after a major success suggests desperation rather than strategy. Margaret nodded, surprised by her own calmness in the face of this challenge. 3 years ago, she would have prepared an aggressive defense, compiled ammunition against each board member, strategized counterattacks. Now she felt oddly detached from the political maneuvering, more concerned with actual governance than power dynamics. Let him play it then. I'll attend with quarterly projections showing how the merger positions us for 30% growth by year-end. James looked up from the document, his expression thoughtful. Would you like me to accompany you? The offer touched Margaret deeply. After all he had put him through, James still stood ready to support her against threats to her leadership. No, but thank you. This is one battle I need to fight alone, not because I don't value your help, but because I need to demonstrate the new leadership approach we've discussed. The board needs to see that yesterday wasn't an aberration, but a transformation. James nodded, understanding perfectly. Then let me help you prepare. Patterson will focus on 3 vulnerabilities. They spent the next hour analyzing likely challenges and formulating responses based not on counterattacks, but on substantive leadership philosophy. James's diplomatic experience provided invaluable perspective on boardroom dynamics, helping Margaret anticipate objections and address them constructively. When Margaret's phone chimed with a reminder for the board meeting, she felt prepared in a way that transcended her usual combative readiness. This wasn't about winning a fight, but about articulating a vision. I should go. She gathered her materials, then paused at the door. If this goes sideways, James, I want you to know that your position is secure regardless. I've made certain the merger agreement includes specific language protecting your role during implementation. The revelation surprised him. You anticipated Patterson might try to remove me. Margaret smiled ruefully. I've spent years studying how to outmaneuver opponents, James. I finally decided to use those skills for something worthwhile. Before he could respond, her phone rang, Rebecca calling with a pre-board meeting update. Margaret answered, listening briefly before her expression changed to one of confusion. Dave, what? Are you certain? James watched curiously as Margaret ended the call, a bemused smile spreading across her face. The emergency board meeting has been canceled. Apparently, Nakamura called Patterson directly to express his enthusiasm about working with me specifically. He mentioned that any leadership change would cause Naka Singh to reevaluate the merger terms. James's eyebrows rose. That's unconventional corporate diplomacy. Margaret laughed, a genuine sound so rarely heard in these offices that several passing employees turned in surprise. I believe I'm experiencing what diplomats call unexpected foreign intervention in domestic affairs. The shared joke marked another shift in their evolving relationship from employer-employee to allies to something approaching friendship. Patterson's surrender cleared Margaret's schedule unexpectedly. She glanced at her watch, considering options. It's barely 3. What would you normally be doing at this hour, James? The question caught him off guard. For 3 years, she had never once inquired about his schedule or preferences, simply assuming his availability for whatever she required. On Fridays, driving to Baltimore to have dinner with Sarah. His voice softened at the mention of his daughter. It's our tradition. I'd arrive around 6, we'd have dinner, then Saturday morning breakfast, before I drive back. Margaret made an immediate decision. You should go. Now, take the company car and drive her. Be with your daughter tonight. James hesitated, professional responsibility warring with personal desire. There's still the integration planning meeting at 5, which can happen Monday morning. Margaret's tone brooked no argument. The merger is signed, the board threat neutralized, security protocols in place. Everything else can wait. James studied her face, searching for the Margaret Reynolds who had once berated him for taking a personal day when his daughter was ill. Finding no trace of that woman, he nodded in acceptance. Thank you. I'll call Sarah right away. As James gathered his belongings, Margaret found herself contemplating the weekend ahead. Emma would arrive tomorrow morning for her rare visit home. Normally, Margaret would spend today preparing detailed activities designed to maximize their limited time together. Museum visits, theatrical performances, shopping excursions, a carefully orchestrated simulation of maternal involvement. For the first time, she questioned this approach. Had she been trying to impress her daughter, rather than connect with her, creating experiences, rather than building relationship? James was halfway to the door when Margaret spoke again. James, about Sunday dinner. Would you consider bringing Sarah? I'd like Emma to meet her. The invitation clearly surprised him. Sarah would enjoy that, I think. She doesn't get many opportunities to visit New York. Margaret nodded, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest at the thought of their daughter's meeting. Sarah might have insights for Emma about growing up with a parent in a demanding profession. The unspoken subtext hung between them that both daughters had experienced the challenges of a single parent's career sacrifices, though in dramatically different ways. James recognized the gesture for what it was, not merely a social invitation, but Margaret's attempt to create connections that might help her daughter navigate their changing relationship. We'd be honored to join you. 6 o'clock, perfect. I'll text you my address. As James departed, Margaret found herself standing alone in her office, surveying the space with new eyes. The carefully curated environment, designed to intimidate and impress rather than welcome, suddenly seemed foreign to her evolving sensibilities. On impulse, she called the office manager. Janet, I'd like to redesign my office next week. Something warmer, more conversational. Maybe some plants. And relocate that ridiculous throne of a chair to storage. The weekend unfolded with unexpected grace. Emma arrived Saturday morning, initially wary of her mother's atypical warmth. By evening, however, the teenager had begun to relax into this new dynamic, a mother who asked questions and actually listened to answers, who shared personal stories rather than performance metrics, who seemed genuinely interested in Emma's experiences at school beyond academic achievements. They cooked together, something they had never done, creating spectacular messes while following a recipe Margaret's mother had once taught her. They talked about Margaret's father's stories Emma had never heard about, the construction worker who had dreamed of seeing his daughter graduate college. Sunday morning, they walked through Central Park without scheduled activities or educational agendas, simply enjoying each other's company. Emma revealed her interest in photography, a passion she had previously kept hidden, fearing her mother would dismiss it as impractical. Instead, Margaret listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions about technique and inspiration. When Emma hesitantly showed photos stored on her phone, Margaret recognized real talent in the composition and lighting. You have a gift, Emma. These are extraordinary. The teenager blushed, unused to such specific praise from her achievement-oriented mother. It's just a hobby. Margaret stopped walking, turning to face her daughter directly. Never diminish your talents, Emma. Not for anyone, especially not for me. Emma studied her mother's face, searching for insincerity or manipulation. Finding none, she asked the question that had been hovering since her arrival. Mom, what's happened to you? You're so different. Margaret considered her response carefully, recognizing the importance of this moment. I met someone who helped me see myself clearly for the first time in years, and I didn't particularly like what I saw. The admission of vulnerability previously unimaginable from the Margaret Reynolds that Emma knew created an opening between them. Emma's voice dropped to a near whisper. Is it like a relationship? Are you dating someone? Margaret laughed, surprised by the question. No, nothing like that. A colleague who became a friend, I suppose. Someone whose wisdom I've come to respect enormously. You'll meet him tonight, actually. He's bringing his daughter to dinner. Emma's eyes widened with teenage speculation, but Margaret simply smiled, neither confirming nor denying her daughter's unspoken theories. Some transformations defied simple categorization. They returned to the townhouse to prepare for dinner. Margaret found herself actually enjoying the process of cooking something she'd previously considered a waste of valuable time. Emma set the table, arranging flowers they'd purchased from a street vendor in the park. At precisely 6 o'clock, the doorbell chimed. Margaret smoothed her casual slacks, so different from her usual formal business attire, and opened the door to welcome James and Sarah Wilson. James looked different in weekend clothes, more relaxed in khakis, and a blue button-down shirt that matched his eyes. Sarah, at 22, carried herself with the poised confidence of a young woman who knew her purpose in life. Her resemblance to James was striking, the same thoughtful eyes, the same quiet dignity. Introductions flowed naturally. Emma, initially shy, bloomed under Sarah's friendly interest. Within minutes, the teenagers had discovered shared tastes in music and films despite their age difference. Dinner proceeded with easy conversation. James shared stories from his diplomatic career, the humorous cultural misunderstandings, the behind-the-scenes moments of international relations. Sarah described her medical studies with passionate enthusiasm, explaining complex concepts in accessible terms. Margaret observed the interactions, particularly noting how James engaged with Emma, asking thoughtful questions about her interests, listening attentively to her responses, treating her ideas with genuine respect. The contrast with Margaret's previous approach to parent-child communication couldn't have been more stark. After dinner, Sarah volunteered to help Emma with a school photography project, the two disappearing upstairs to examine Emma's camera equipment. Margaret and James moved to the small garden terrace, where the unusually warm October evening permitted outdoor conversation. They're getting along well. Margaret handed James a glass of wine as they settled into adjacent chairs. Sarah enjoys mentoring. She volunteers with high school students interested in medical careers. Margaret watched a monarch butterfly navigate her small herb garden, its orange wings catching the fading sunlight. She's remarkable, James. You've raised an extraordinary young woman. James's gaze followed the butterfly's path, his expression softening with paternal pride. She made it easy. Even in our hardest times after Catherine died, Sarah maintained this essential goodness, an ability to see beauty and purpose amidst pain. The simple statement crystallized something Margaret had been struggling to articulate about her own parenting journey. I think I've been trying to protect Emma from pain by teaching her to be invulnerable. But that's not really protection, is it? James considered her words carefully. Pain is inevitable in any meaningful life, Margaret. Our job isn't to prevent it, but to help our children develop the resilience to move through it with their humanity intact. The butterfly landed on a lavender plant, wings opening and closing slowly in the evening light. Margaret watched it, absorbing James's wisdom. I've been so focused on making Emma strong that I forgot to show her how to be human. From inside the house came the sound of laughter, Sarah and Emma sharing some private joke. The joyful noise wrapped around Margaret's heart like a warm embrace. It's not too late, James assured her. Emma is remarkably open to your changes. She sees your effort. The simple validation meant more than any corporate accolade Margaret had ever received. For the first time in years, she felt the burden of perpetual performance lifting from her shoulders. Here in this moment, she wasn't CEO Margaret Reynolds, but simply Margaret, a mother trying to do better, a human being acknowledging her imperfections. You make it look so effortless, James. Balancing purpose with humanity. James laughed softly, the sound carrying gentle self-deprecation. Nothing about the past 10 years has been effortless, Margaret. I've made countless mistakes. Asked Sarah to grow up too quickly, worked jobs beneath my capabilities while pretending it didn't wound my pride, smiled through parent-teacher conferences where other mothers whispered about the sad single dad. His candid admission of struggle touched Margaret deeply. The man she had once dismissed as just the help had navigated challenges she couldn't imagine, maintaining dignity and purpose through it all. How did you do it? How did you keep going when everything seemed designed to diminish you? James was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. His response when it came carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Every morning I asked myself one question. What example am I setting for Sarah today? That perspective clarified everything. Professional humiliations, financial struggles, social rejections. If I could face each challenge with grace, then regardless of outcomes, I was teaching Sarah how to live with integrity. The butterfly lifted from the lavender, circling once around their heads before disappearing over the garden wall. Margaret watched it go, thinking about the transformation it represented, the beauty that emerges from complete dissolution of what came before. I'd like to try this approach with Emma, to focus less on what she achieves and more on how she becomes. James nodded, understanding the profound shift this represented in Margaret's parenting philosophy. It's never too late to change the story you're telling, either to yourself or to your child. The French doors opened as Sarah and Emma stepped onto the terrace, both laughing about something on Emma's phone. Margaret observed the easy camaraderie between them with a mixture of gratitude and wistfulness, grateful for Sarah's natural mentorship, wistful for the years of connection she had sacrificed on the altar of achievement. Sarah glanced at her watch, then at her father. "Dad, we should probably head out if we're going to make the last train to Baltimore." James nodded, rising from his chair. "Thank you for a lovely evening, Margaret. Emma, it was wonderful meeting you." As they gathered belongings and moved toward the front door, Margaret made a spontaneous decision. "Wait, there's no need for trains. I'll have my driver take you back to Baltimore." James began to protest, but Margaret held up her hand. "Please, James. After everything you've done for me for Mediscan, it's the least I can offer. The company car is just sitting in the garage otherwise." He acquiesced with graceful thanks. Sarah hugged Emma goodbye, promising to send information about a photography workshop she'd mentioned during their conversation. At the door, James turned to Margaret. "Tomorrow morning in integration planning at 9? Margaret nodded, suddenly aware of the strange intersection they now occupied, colleagues and friends, their professional and personal lives no longer neatly separated. After they departed, Emma helped Margaret clear the dinner dishes, unusually thoughtful as she loaded the dishwasher. Finally, she asked the question that had clearly been percolating all evening. "Mom, is Mr. Wilson the reason you've changed so much?" Margaret considered how to explain the complex catalyst James had provided in her life. "Not exactly. He showed me a mirror, Emma. I didn't like what I saw, so I decided to change it." Emma absorbed this, her teenage wisdom, sometimes startling in its directness. "He's really nice and smart, and Sarah's cool." Margaret smiled at her daughter's assessment. "Yes, they're both pretty extraordinary." Emma hesitated, then pressed further. "Were you really mean to him?" Before the question pierced Margaret's heart with its innocent precision. "Yes," she admitted. "I was cruel and dismissive. I saw his job, not his humanity." The teenager contemplated this with surprising maturity. "But you're fixing it now, right?" "Making it better, I'm trying, every day." Emma nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer. "That's what matters, I think, that you're trying." From the mouth of babes, Margaret thought, marveling at her daughter's capacity for forgiveness and her instinctive understanding of redemption's path. Monday morning arrived with crystalline autumn sunshine streaming through Margaret's office windows. The space felt different, somehow less a fortress and more a workshop where important things were created through collaboration. James arrived precisely at 8:30, carrying 2 coffee cups from the artisanal cafe near his Queens apartment. He placed one on Margaret's desk, prepared exactly as she preferred it, knowledge acquired through 3 years of coffee runs. The gesture touched her, not because he'd brought coffee, but because the roles had reversed so naturally. The server had become the served without resentment or scorekeeping. "How was the rest of your weekend?" James settled into the chair across from her desk, his manner comfortably professional, yet tinged with new familiarity. "Good. Really good, actually." Margaret sipped the perfectly prepared coffee. "Emma and I had breakfast this morning before her train back to school. We really talked for the first time in years. James smiled, genuine pleasure lighting his features. I'm glad to hear it. Sarah mentioned she's already exchanged several texts with Emma about photography techniques. The easy connection between their daughters delighted Margaret in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Something about the next generation transcending the barriers their parents had constructed and demolished. The integration planning meeting proceeded with unprecedented efficiency. James's diplomatic experience provided perfect preparation for merging disparate corporate cultures. By noon, they had established clear protocols for department integration, communication frameworks, and milestone measurements. As the meeting concluded and executives filed out, Rebecca entered with tablets containing the afternoon schedule. She distributed them efficiently, pausing before James with uncharacteristic hesitation. Mr. Wilson Facilities wanted to confirm your office location. The space adjacent to Margaret's is being prepared, but they need approval for the connecting door installation. James glanced at Margaret, eyebrows raised in question. Connecting door. Margaret nodded, unapologetic about the executive decision she'd made without consultation. The integration process will require constant communication between us. Efficiency dictates proximity. The explanation sounded entirely professional, though both recognized the deeper significance of physical manifestation of the barrier breaking that had begun in a Mercedes during a rainstorm 3 days earlier. Rebecca departed, leaving them momentarily alone in the conference room. James organized his notes with characteristic precision, his expression thoughtful. Margaret about the executive vice president position. She tensed slightly, preparing for his potential rejection of the role she had created without prior discussion. I'd like to accept with one condition. His voice remained even diplomatic. Name it. That we establish a mentorship program for the company. Identifying overlooked talent. Creating advancement pathways. Ensuring no one else experiences what I did for 3 years. The request surprised her, not self-focused as she had expected, but system-changing, addressing the underlying cultural issues rather than personal grievance. Margaret felt something expand in her chest, respect blossoming into admiration for this man who consistently thought beyond himself to the wider impact of each decision. Absolutely. We'll make it part of your official responsibilities. I'll have HR begin development immediately. They walked together toward Margaret's office, discussing implementation details. As they passed the executive suite, Marcus Hale emerged from his office, his expression carefully neutral as he registered their easy camaraderie. Margaret James, the quarterly projections reflect significant upside from the merger. Analysts are already upgrading our stock to strong buy, and the information represented both olive branch and validation, Marcus acknowledging the success of decisions he had initially opposed. Excellent news, Marcus. James's response carried no hint of vindication, only professional appreciation for positive developments. The technical teams are already identifying integration efficiencies beyond our initial models. Margaret observed the exchange with newfound clarity. Once she would have seized this moment to remind Marcus of his mistaken opposition. James instead built a bridge forward, focusing on shared success rather than past conflict. They continued toward her office where preliminary designs for the space renovation awaited approval. The proposed changes reflected Margaret's evolving leadership philosophy: open, rather than intimidating; collaborative rather than hierarchical; human-centered rather than power-projecting. As they reviewed the designs together, Margaret found herself contemplating the extraordinary journey of the past 72 hours. From crisis to triumph, from isolation to connection, from fear-based leadership to purpose-driven collaboration. James noticed her momentary introspection. Second thoughts about the redesign. Not at all. Margaret smiled, the expression coming more naturally with each passing day. I was just thinking about how quickly everything has changed. 3 days ago, I was a different person leading a different company. James considered this, his diplomatic mind, always careful with words. Not different, perhaps. Just incomplete. You've always had the capacity for this kind of leadership, Margaret. You simply needed permission to express it. Permission. The concept struck her as foreign. She had spent a career taking what she wanted, never asking permission for anything. James clarified gently. Not from others, from yourself. Permission to value connection alongside achievement. To measure success in human terms rather than just financial ones. The insight penetrated to the core of her transformation. Margaret Reynolds, who had climbed corporate ladders by stepping on fingers and faces, had finally granted herself permission to lead with both strength and humanity. Outside the window, Manhattan stretched in gleaming autumn splendor, a city of ambition and opportunity, of harshness and beauty, existing in perpetual tension. Somewhere in those streets, 200 Mediscan employees would continue their lives, their jobs, secure their futures preserved by the unlikely partnership that had formed in a luxury car during a rainstorm. Margaret turned from the window to face James directly. "Thank you," she said simply, "not just for saving Mediscan, but for showing me a better way to lead, to live." James accepted her gratitude with characteristic grace. "We all need someone who sees us clearly. Margaret, both our flaws and our potential. I'm grateful to have been that person for you." The statement carried no hint of the resentment she might have expected given their history. Instead, it offered the possibility that their journey together had meaning beyond corporate salvation, that in the act of seeing her clearly, James had also been seen. A new message appeared on Margaret's tablet, Rebecca notifying her that the Nakasing technical team had arrived for the afternoon integration session. The merger implementation was proceeding, the future unfolding according to their careful design. Margaret gathered her materials, preparing to continue the work of rebuilding Metascan from the inside out. As she and James walked together toward the conference room, no glass partitions separated them, no hierarchy defined their steps. Just two people who had discovered through crisis and revelation that the distance between driver and driven was always an illusion, that true power existed not in position, but in partnership, not in title, but in truth.